We are very happy to welcome as well Dr. Leor Zmigrod, who completed her PhD at Cambridge University as a Gates Scholar and was awarded a Junior Research Fellowship. She has held visiting fellowships at Stanford, Harvard, and the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And she has received too many prizes for me to read right now, but among them the Glushko Prize by the Cognitive Science Society, the Forbes 30 Under 30 in Science, and many others. So thank you so much, Dr. Zmigrod, for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll switch screens with you, Paulius. Perfect, and it's been wonderful starting to meet some of you earlier today, and looking forward to continuing to have these conversations here in Paris. It's wonderful to be here. So it's quite a long title, and I promise that by the end of these 20 minutes, it will become clear what I mean when I want to talk about the science of ideological consciousness. A lot of very loaded words, but it all builds on my experimental research in cognitive science and neuroscience of ideology. So thinking about how we can study what makes people attracted to certain ideologies, or to take ideologies to an extreme degree, and how that might relate to their brains, to the functioning of their brains. And as I've been working on this, I've gotten the sense that this is not only interesting scientifically, but it might also hold these interesting philosophical implications. And that's the project that I'm here to explore. So I'll kind of be building, I'll give you a flavor of what my experimental work is, and then kind of what the philosophical project is going to be. And I realize that philosophers don't usually ask for scientists' opinions. There's usually quite a big divide, but I think that in this case, there's actually really interesting dialogue that can be had about what this science, this neuroscience, can bring to philosophy of mind and to philosophy of politics and power. So to begin, I just wanted to firstly dive into consciousness and to what consciousness is. And I thought maybe, given that we're in Paris, there's no better way than taking a stroll in the Marais district. And so imagine that we're walking, we're conscious human beings experiencing the world, we're seeing people, we're seeing objects, our perception of the environment is very dynamic. As we're walking, we can see objects, we can see colors, textures, we hear the sound of the crunch of our feet on the gravel. It's a very multi-sensory experience. The wind is in our hair. And as we're kind of experiencing the world and orienting around it, we can kind of see objects that attract our attention. We have a sense that we have a continuous experience of the world. It's surprisingly coherent. It's almost this miraculous thing about our conscious experience in the world, is that it's not fragmented or disunited. It's all kind of continuous and makes sense. And it operates as we move through the world, as we produce actions, as we pursue goals, as we see a kind of little alley that we're gonna now walk down. You know, our consciousness is this really multifaceted, multimodal, like Edwin said, experience, and it's very visual and sensory, and leads to a lot of interesting kind of philosophical and psychological questions. And so when we're thinking about consciousness in this more like perceptual, psychological way, we're really thinking about it as it goes from this kind of spectrum, from perception through to attention and to more higher level cognition and decision making. And philosophers of mind are interested in the nature of consciousness and whether it even exists, the nature of our mental faculties, what it means to integrate sensations and sensory inputs into kind of a unitary, coherent perception, our phenomenology, our sensory kind of perceptual experience of the world, and how our brains infer causality, how they link chains of events together, how they understand intentions and generate intentions. And these are all wonderful and quite abstract constructs. And so when experimental psychologists are interested in grounding them, we really think about, well, what can we measure when we want to measure consciousness? So to do that, some of the methods we use include perceptual and cognitive tasks that we give participants that kind of reduce the very, what we would say is simple stroll down the road, but it's actually a lot of input and a lot for the brain to handle, even when it's not necessarily a complex task. But we can, with cognitive tasks and tests, we can kind of reduce that to study the elemental building blocks of perception and cognition. We can also have neuroscientific measurements of a brain's function and structure. There could be physiological measurements of how our body responds to stimuli, whether that's the heart rate or the kind of the muscles in our face or the skin conductance and how it responds to different stimuli. And in all these ways of basically trying to measure consciousness, sometimes we're looking at universal effects, so how consciousness operates in every brain for every person. But sometimes we can also measure individual differences. And that's something that I'm particularly interested in the slight variations in how each of us perceives the world, integrates the sensations together to form cognitions and decisions. And so when I've measured individual differences, one realm I've looked at a lot is cognitive flexibility and rigidity, which is basically kind of an individual difference trait. Some of us are more cognitively flexible and more cognitively rigid than others. And we can measure that by giving these kind of neuropsychological tasks that look at how adaptable people are in light of new information or new situations. So for instance, we might present participants with a kind of cognitive task, which I could see is visually very simple. The participants are asked to sort cards from the bottom according to some rules. So maybe they figure out that they can match the color to the right color. And they do this for a while. And after a certain period of time, the rule changes. And the cognitively flexible person will recognize the change and will act upon it. Will now switch to maybe categorizing the cards according to the shape of them rather than the color. And a cognitively rigid person will really struggle to engage with a change. They might kind of continue to try the old rule, even though it no longer works. They'll really be destabilized by any kind of change. And so that's one way in which we can measure individual differences in cognition. Another way is to go more down, like even more low level to perception and look at perceptual learning and decision making. So for example, I might give participants this task where just simple dots are moving on a screen, and I tell them, tell me when you think the dots are moving to the left or to the right. So these decisions are happening very quickly, within a second, 2 seconds. And from that, we can extract interesting things about how our brains learn, how our brains make these small perceptual decisions. Do they need a lot of evidence? Do they wait a while before deciding, yes, the dots are moving to the left or to the right? Some of you might be looking right now, it's a jumble, so there's no direction. But so we can look at how much sensory evidence a person needs before committing to a decision, whether they're very cautious and, really wait a while, or whether they can just go for it. Some learn more quickly, some learn more slowly. So with these very simple tasks, we can study and measure individual differences in fundamental perception. And the question that I've been thinking about a lot is, well, does the particular operation in perception and cognition of a brain's functioning, could that be linked to the ideologies that a person chooses and adheres to passionately, and whether they adhere to them dogmatically and rigidly, or whether they're kind of more, moderate evidence-sensitive thinkers? And to summarize many studies with thousands of participants, what we find is that there is this relationship between individuals' perceptual and cognitive traits on these kinds of neuropsychological tasks and their ideological beliefs and convictions and preferences on, these much more higher level concepts, which has been fascinating to see. And I'll give you some examples to give you a taste of what that looks like. So for instance, when looking at cognitive rigidity versus flexibility, what we see is that people who perform as very cognitively rigid on those kinds of tasks, they're also, in the domain of ideologies, more likely to support ideological violence in the name of their cause. They're more likely to be willing to harm and hurt other people, to harm themselves in the name of the cause or the group. And so what we're seeing is that there's kind of this parallel where cognitive rigidity in neuropsychological settings is accompanied by ideological rigidity in political settings. And we see this also when we look more explicitly at like the political spectrum and partisanship. So we see that when we kind of draw out extremity in both directions, rigidity is high both for the extreme right, for people who identify strongly with the right, and for those on the left. But there's kind of this U-shaped curve where actually the most flexible people are the people who sit kind of in the middle. And this might seem intuitive, like yes, like some kind of ideological extremity would be accompanied by a cognitive rigidity, but it's amazing for a couple of reasons. One is that actually political psychologists have long thought that this would not be a U-shaped curve, that this would be a line, that the right are naturally rigid and the left is naturally flexible. But actually, when we find sensitive measurements of the left, we can find kind of the dogmatic left as well that we find. And it's also interesting because these are very different kinds of measurements. So when you're measuring a person's ideology, you know, that's on the realm of political beliefs, convictions that are developed over long periods of time. And these measures of cognition are happening very quickly. They're in second by second, they're in neutral, non-political contexts, as you can see with the visual shapes. So it is striking for a lot of reasons. And we also found that when we give those kinds of perceptual decision-making tasks, that people who struggle to integrate the evidence that they see in front of them on a sensory level are also going to have to be more dogmatic and closed-minded, and to seem to struggle to integrate, you know, other kinds of evidence in flexible ways. The ones that are more cautious, even when selecting whether the dots are moving to the left or to the right, they're also, we find them to be more politically conservative, so they lean more conservative, which I found really interesting because caution, the sensory caution that we measure, and caution in many ways are the synonyms for conservatism. So to see that actually the caution with which you encounter sensory stimuli is paralleled by the caution with which you tackle kind of political stimuli, completely different timescales and completely different domains, is still fascinating to me, but as we're finding really consistently. So what we're seeing are these kinds of links between people's styles of attention, perception, cognition in neutral, visual, audiovisual settings, and their styles and their political thinking. We found in their levels of dogmatism and resistance to evidence, their levels of nationalism, their religiosity, the extremism of their beliefs. And this has also been accompanied by research that's more neuroscientific and physiological, so looking at how brain structure and function is related to people's ideologies. So this is all kind of coming under the umbrella of political science, political neuroscience, which is this new field that I've been involved with, trying to find these parallels between, in many ways, politics and biology. And as I've been working on it, I've been thinking, well, like, what does all of this mean? Like, this is fascinating, and I want to keep on delving into why these resonances exist. But what do these links between our cognition, our biology, and our ideologies, what do those mean for our philosophical understanding of ideological consciousness? And there are several kind of questions that come under this bigger question. So that can involve, well, how does our sensory and perceptual grasp on the world shape the ideologies that we hold passionately? So kind of what do our sensory traits or neurological traits bring to the table in terms of the ideologies that we choose? And also kind of a reciprocal link, which is, well, how can our minds, brains, and bodies be altered by immersion in dogmatic ideologies? So what does actually, you know, existing in and living according to very rigid principles, what can that do to our bodies? And what does that actually have any philosophical implications for how we understand the brain, the body, and also social kind of and political questions? So this question kind of stands at this nexus of a few fields. So there's experimental psychology, which has been my kind of upbringing. And often philosophy of mind does intersect with psychology. So philosophers of mind are interested in how kind of the psychological concepts or psychological findings to understand how sensations works, how perception works, how attention is brought together. So they are responsive to it. And on the other hand, you have the philosophy of politics, which is responsive to social psychology, about questions about conformity or obedience. So you kind of have philosophy kind of biting into psychology a little bit, maybe actually it's more that philosophy of mind takes quite a bit more from psychology, and political philosophers just nod and look to psychology very occasionally. But I think that actually there's a lot more that we can do, and there's a kind of bridge that we can build. And in terms of the kind of philosophical approaches to ideologies, I've kind of been starting to trace them. That's the paper that the idea that I'm going to be developing here, is to see what can this new science contribute to various kinds of approaches in philosophy towards thinking about ideologies. So there's kind of more traditional way of thinking about political philosophy, which asks, well, how and why do people aggregate together into political collectives? Actually, it was so nice to build on, in some ways, Leslie Ann's question was about kind of, how people come together in democratic settings, how they should or shouldn't. And we have this quite vivid image in a lot of, political thinking about like the Hobbes's Leviathan of like people becoming little constituents of this bigger state. So it's a classic kind of question of political philosophy. There's also the more like mid-20th century philosophy also happening very much in Europe about why and how people obey institutions and learn to self-discipline to become kind of docile citizens who obey authorities in the states. And obviously Foucault and Arendt worked on that in different ways to think about, what brings people to obey different kinds of institutions, whether valid or not. There's another strand or stream in a way that thinks really about how and why people perceive themselves and others in different kinds of interactions. So the kind of phenomenology of, in some ways, identity, but just of every experience. And Frantz Fanon talked about this very well in thinking about what it means to be a raced subject or a raced witness or a raced person in an interaction. And how that kind of race might precede your existence in the eyes of others. And finally, there's a much more modern kind of take in political and moral philosophy, which thinks about how and why citizens and philosophers in particular should critique bad ideologies. So those are often taken to be capitalistic or neoliberal ideologies, or racist or sexist ideologies. And this kind of comes under the strand of ideology critique, which also blends with arts and film and cinema. But in philosophy, very much is often taken from the perspective of epistemology, sometimes from a more political sense of activism and resistance. We need to identify which ideologies are bad. We need to know why they're bad, why we should believe particular good ideologies and not bad ideologies. And so that's the kind of modern take on ideology critique. And so the current project is kind of born from the observation that a lot of these approaches focus on the relationship between mind and politics, but they do so very much in the domain of social identities and kind of political subjectivities. So for instance, what it means to be a gendered subject or a raced subject, or kind of what it means to like how our minds operate in social and cultural contexts. But I think that from all of the kind of empirical work that I've been doing and learning about in context of ideologies, I feel like we can actually think about the ideological brain in a fuller sense, not just as what is happening to the brain when it's in political and social exchanges, but given that we see that actually almost the signatures of our ideologies are present even when we're not thinking about politics at all, maybe we also need to think about what it means for a brain to become ideological and for that to spill into non-political and non-social situations, and to kind of the very functioning of the brain and the mind, so that ideology becomes embodied literally within the brain and the body, not just as a kind of metaphorical kind of sense. And so in the project here, I'm kind of thinking about whether we can develop what I'm calling a political philosophy of mind, which is kind of to bridge these two, the philosophy of mind and political philosophy, by thinking about how this new field, this new science, can actually kind of bring them into dialogue by showing that there are actually links between the fundamental operations of our minds, our consciousness, our perception, our attention, typically in philosophy of mind, and the operation of our ideologies, typically reserved to the realm of political philosophy. And so I'm kind of thinking about whether we can find a way to bring these together to create what I call an empirically informed political philosophy of mind. Very wordy, but for now it's capturing the idea in some way, like a philosophy of mind that thinks about the operation of the brain in connection to political ideological concerns, and that is fundamentally empirically informed. So it's informed by the science, it is triggered by the science and continues to follow the science in a way. So that we can kind of ask this question of, how should these findings from political neuroscience inform our understanding, even just of phenomenology and epistemology in themselves? Because if we see these resonances, does that mean that we need to slightly rethink about where our ideas come from, where our phenomenological sensations or experiences of the world come from, if they're so closely tied to our ideological convictions in some ways? Obviously, there is a question of causality there that I talk about elsewhere. We can talk at lunches as well. But I think that there is a way in which this science can inform questions in philosophy of mind, but also questions about power and politics, because suddenly I think that the stakes become much higher if really it's not just that when we're making political arguments, we're fighting over rights and privileges. We're also actually fighting over our bodies and how our bodies are learning to respond to the environment and to any kind of information. I think it elevates the stakes in some ways. So I'm really interested in exploring these questions. I'll probably be generating a lot of new questions and maybe some answers, but that's part of the kind of overall idea behind the project I'll be working here for the month. So really excited to continue these conversations over this month and to hear your questions now. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, we have some minutes for questions. I see there's one in the chat, so we can start with that. So Daniel is in a library, but he says, thanks, Leor. I think these are very interesting ideas. I wondered how you think normativity fits into this connection between low-level cognition and high-level political thought. A perceptual psychologist might tell us that some kinds of low-level processing are better or more correct than others. For example, more sensory integration equals good, less sensory integration equals bad. If your high-level politics is connected to low-level perception, does that mean some political stances are more correct too?
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great question. And I guess there's normativity in many ways, hidden in your question, right? There's kind of almost like psychological well-being or health or ability in a way, like cognitive ability. And for instance, you gave the example of the sensory integration, and it's true that there is a little bit of a you're better if you integrate the evidence in a better way or more efficiently or more quickly or then that's a good thing. You're performing well in that task in a way. And that's similarly for the test of cognitive flexibility. It is a bit of a kind of one-way spectrum. If you are cognitively flexible, it means you're doing the task well. If you're cognitively rigid, you are struggling against the task in some way. You're not adapting well. Does that mean that people who are cognitively flexible will have the right views? And again, by right or correct, there's so much to unpack there, because there is, they're being more receptive or sensitive to the evidence. And so, maybe that's something that we decide that we can firmly say that's good, that, someone who is more receptive to evidence is a better thinker than someone who is more resistant to it. Throughout the whole thing, though, I do often talk about it as different kinds of cognitive styles, with the understanding that the cognitive styles themselves are indices of difference. I know that there is cognitive ability in good and bad, or form, well or poorly, but in essence, there's still styles or differences in style. A person, I was very worried when some of the first streams of research came out, and it was actually about Brexit and nationalism in the UK, and I was very concerned that there would be like a big tabloid thing saying, you know, Cambridge scientist says Brexit voters are stupid, but that never happened because I think we communicated the kind of cognitive style thing in a sensitive way, that you could be a more, you know, rigid thinker. And a lot of people will tell you that rigidity is really good. So that's actually one of the things I hear a lot from both scientists and kind of the general audiences. They'll be like, great, like to be really, you know, persistent and not distracted and not wishy-washy. Like people are, you know, people have their own normative values layered on top of different terms or constructs. So it's complicated is the answer, but I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And then next, Sally.
Well, thank you, Leor. I love this. I love this research. I was wondering if one empirical angle for your research could be the study of what kind of heuristics people use in the political domain. I mean, for example, people who tend to follow populist leaders, we could think is because they have difficulty to understand complex phenomena, so they go for easy explanation. And an easy one is to follow the leader. We know that humans are cognitive misers, and so they use heuristics, which are shortcuts using just one aspect of the situation to make a decision. And in a way, perhaps follow the leader is one of these, right? But so maybe because heuristics are also socially constructed, right? So perhaps the study of what heuristics we construct are part of this political research program that you have, and what are the ones that they're using, maybe one also. So it could be a very concrete aspect. I don't know.
Yeah, I love that idea actually, because of there's sometimes a bit of a divide between the heuristics literature and the kind of more like classic cognitive psychology literature. Like it's weird. That has come up less, but I actually love that idea because there are a range of these heuristics, and we do know that there are differences in how people perform on them. And in some sense, what's nice about that is that the understanding of those heuristics is quite established already. Like there is kind of a big mountain of evidence, whereas some of the findings have come from like, you know, very theory driven, like thought about the links between ideological rigidity and cognitive rigidity, and we search for it. Other things kind of come from the data. So it's also interesting to add another angle of these kinds of heuristics where we might expect these resonances or are curious to see whether the resonances exist, and whether they're constrained to political thinking or still outside of that domain. And I'm always interested in what's domain general and what's domain specific in all these kinds of balances. So I'll be thinking about that actually. I think that's a really good avenue to pursue. Thank you.
Well,
oh, I think you just muted.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Gerd Granzer is going to be at the Institute in 10 days for just 2 days. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Great. Thank you. Next, we have Hendrik, I think.
Thanks a lot for a really interesting presentation. I look forward to meeting you over lunch and to hear more about this. Just have a question about the U-shape graph you showed previously, because I was wondering, how do you draw the distinction between left and right? It seemed a little bit simplistic. I mean, I have noted down here, for example, it could be that you would associate left with socialism and capitalism with right. But there's also another distinction in political philosophy, for example, between liberalism and communitarianism.
Yeah.
And so liberals could be seen as promoters of capitalism, which would put them on the right, but they could also be seen as, you know, like fighting for individual rights, which could be on the left-hand side, at least from the perspective of some. There's also like a distinction between woke culture and cultural conservatives, for example, which is yet another distinction which could cut across the two previous ones. Yeah. So in mapping out this, I was just wondering what do you put emphasis on? Because I mean, it becomes quite important in relation to your other dimension, which is about flexible versus rigid
Thank you.
cognition. So I would like to hear if you could elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, thanks. And I kind of purposefully quickly created these non-data kind of slides because I knew there was no time to start describing the data today. But in the kind of studies where we've looked for that U-shaped curve, that one was actually really focusing on, and like you said, you could focus on policy-specific kind of ideology. You can look at identity. You can there is a whole spectrum. So that was a simplification for the purpose of this quick talk. But there it was like this one study that showed this clearly was in about 700 people in the States. And what we looked at was how their what we call identity fusion. So how much they merge their personal identity with a collective identity for the main political parties. And so what we saw there, what I asked each participant was, you see, you literally drew, there was a big circle that said like Republican Party and a little circle that said me or you. And each participant was invited to bring that circle like dynamically, like close or far away. They could move wherever they wanted, and they could put the little circle completely inside. They could be completely fused with the Republican Party. They could be slightly overlapped. They could be on the side of. Anyways, it was a continuous kind of measurement, and we did that twice for each party because it's often a misconception that people have a single overwhelming allegiance to one. People will be somewhere in the middle. They'll inch themselves a bit closer or further. And then the idea was to actually subtract the difference and kind of look at the value of where they lean, whether they basically fuse themselves completely to the right and move the circle away from the Democratic Party and vice versa. So it's kind of complicated. It's like I can chat about it at length, but basically it was more to focus on partisanship identity and where people place themselves in relative terms. In the actual academic paper, I wouldn't say extreme left and extreme right. It was about partisanship identities, but for the sake of today, it's to see that. And what you raised about those other kinds of dimensions is kind of one of the future directions for the research, is to think about, well, how can we measure new and emerging forms of ideologies or old ones that are repackaged to see different kinds of dogmatisms, whether that's, about cultural issues or, environmental issues. It can be, there are many different kinds of dogmatisms that we can measure and put on multiple kinds of axes. So part of the future direction is to look at how that operates in relation to the content of the ideology, or whether it's really extremity and dogmatism and kind of tight, passionate fusion of the identity that's the main driver.
Great. We have a small comment in the chat. It seems also in a quiet place now. Just a comment: potential cultural determinism via our DNA. Interesting and a bit scary at the same time.
Yeah. So really good. Thank you, Gail, for seeing that, because it's both scary and interesting, like you said, scary and interesting. But actually, because our individual differences in a lot of these traits, like cognitive rigidity and flexibility, is partially genetically influenced, not determined. It's not determined because person with the same gene can have many different manifestations. But I've actually done some research on the kind of role of dopamine genes in cognitive rigidity and flexibility, to show which genes that affect the dopamine distribution in the brain, how those relate to people's performance on cognitive flexibility and rigidity tasks. But what's important there is there isn't a determinism at play. You see kind of biological risk factors lending themselves towards cognitive vulnerabilities, which lend themselves towards maybe political or ideological vulnerabilities. So yeah, you're raising the question of how people could be manipulated by these. I'm not sure if you mean manipulated by the knowledge of biology being influenced here, or more manipulated because like some people are at higher risk? Like if you are naturally more cognitively rigid, maybe then, oh, and use of hormones. Okay, this is a whole other question. I think we're gonna have to chat, Gail, over lunch. This is becoming a bigger and bigger question. But no, but thank you so much for them. We'll follow up because this is, otherwise I'll go on a long rant. And it's Friday afternoon. And thank you everyone for staying for this late afternoon.
Wonderful. Okay, yes, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Zmigrod, for joining us. Thank you so much, everyone.